Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
Last time on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so elated to talk about Catholic theology and teaching regarding magic, the Grimoires, exorcism, demons, and more. Jimmy is also a prolific author. One of my favorite books, by the way, listeners, check this out. We'll have links below, is Teaching with Authority, about what the church really says in its documents. But in addition to all of that, Jimmy Akin is the proprietor of an excellent podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. What does the Catholic Church teach when it comes to magic? What are demons? What does Catholic teaching say leads to diabolic possession? As we've discussed on the show many times, magic and Catholicism have deep entwining historical roots or similar touch points going back literally 1,000 years and more. And as someone who grew up Catholic, I was an altar boy, went to a Catholic middle school, I want to know the Catholic theological thinking on esotericism, but also to challenge my own beliefs on the Grimoires, on esoteric practice, and more. This chat with such an esteemed theologian will be a great thought starter for you as well. Jimmy Akin, thank you so much for taking the time and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Well, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
You're listening to episode 383 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about grimoires, the occult, and other mysterious subjects. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the episode. We'll have your feedback on our recent episode on the Hell House of Martinez. But first, last week, we heard part one of an interview which Jimmy did on a podcast called Glitch Bottle. It's devoted to ceremonial magic as opposed to stage magic. And the ceremonial magicians who listen had lots of questions for Jimmy and how the Catholic faith understands magic. But they put yet more questions to Jimmy. So what did the magicians want to know this time? How did Jimmy respond? And what would a Catholic perspective on these questions be? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So, Jimmy, what should we know before listening to part two of your interview?
Well, this was a very interesting interview for me to do, and some of the topics that you heard the host of Glitch Bottle, Alexander Eth, mention in the opening are actually topics that we covered the basics of last week, so you can listen to those episodes for more information. Also, as we mentioned then, I was pleased to be able to address the audience of Glitch Bottle, and I want it to be of as much help as I can to the audience, so I didn't want to just come on and be hostile. I wanted to resist stereotypes that some in the audience might have had come to mind, because you don't generally help people by being hostile. And so I wanted to show the audience that I'm just an ordinary guy, that I've got a sense of humor, that I'm interested in a bunch of subjects, not just Catholicism, and that I try to think through subjects in a fair and open-minded way, while at the same time applying Catholic principles. I also mentioned a name last week that you'll be hearing again this week. You'll hear both the host of Glitch Bottle, Alexander Eth, and me make some references to Dr. Justin Sledge. Justin's a Jewish scholar of the esoteric who runs a YouTube channel called Esoterica, and I've interviewed him here on Mysterious World before about the Kabbalah. That's in episodes 218 and 219 if you want to check them out. We also mentioned grimoires some more, and as I explained last time, the term grimoire has been around in English since the mid-1800s. It comes from the French word grammaire, which means grammar or incantation. So a grimoire is a book of incantations. In other words, it's a book of rituals or spells used in ceremonial magic. Although the term grimoire comes from the mid-1800s, we have grimoires that date back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and they were sometimes used by Catholic priests and other clergy, which leads to the subject that's been called the clerical necromantic underworld, which comes up in our discussion. So you'll be hearing about that. Finally, just at the end of last week's episode, Alex was asking me a question that involved having an open mind, and you'll hear him follow up on that question at the beginning of this part of the interview.
Okay, then let's listen to part 2 of your interview with Glitch Bottle. But first, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Donald M., Sandra M., Haley H., Tess W., and Cecilia W. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, so you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Father Robert Spitzer and the Magis Center's new Critical Catholic Cosmology program. Join a community of adults and educators seeking to grapple with the truth claims of science, philosophy, and the Bible in a classroom environment, with special appearances by Father Spitzer. Ground your faith in evidence with a critical method that integrates heart and mind. Earn 6 graduate credits over 2 semesters at a third of the cost of most graduate programs. Online or in person in the Boston area on Tuesdays beginning October 7th. Go to magiscenter.com/institute. magiscenter.com/institute, or search Critical Catholic Cosmology to register today.
And Jimmy, to that point, especially about keeping an open mind, it's been one of the themes of this conversation, seeing things in different ways, exploring the nuance while showing fidelity, of course, to both faith and reason. We do have another listener question for you from patron Richard Irving. And Richard is asking and saying, quote, "Hi, Mr. Akin. Wow, this is the podcast I always wanted to hear, as I'm a fan of Jimmy's excellent and mysterious work, and I love researching Western esotericism. My question," Richard says, Jimmy, "is on the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verses 24 through 28, where the Pharisees said, quote, 'This man does not..." Meaning Jesus, thank you, "does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons," end quote. And Jesus responds, quote, "And if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out?" End quote. So, Richard says, my question, Jimmy, is twofold. Number one, were there Jewish exorcists operating at the time of Jesus? And number two, was it common to use a higher ranking demon like Beelzebub to successfully manipulate an infernal hierarchical command structure to force lower demons out? Thank you.
Okay, so in regard to the first question, yes, there were Jewish exorcists operating in this time period. We know about them both from elsewhere in the New Testament. Now, earlier I mentioned, Jesus gave the 12 the authority to cast out demons, but then they found someone else who was casting them out, and in Jesus' name. And well, okay, that person was probably Jewish, but he was also using Jesus's name to do it. So what we're really looking for here is, were there Jews who cast out demons without invoking Jesus's name? And the answer is yes. We know about them from multiple sources. One source is actually elsewhere in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, there is a set of sons who are of a Jewish high priest named Sceva, who are casting out demons too. And they're working on this demoniac, and apparently they're all there together. So this would be a really intense exorcism in terms of, you got these 7 sons who were all exorcists apparently doing this. And they're trying to cast the demon out, and they actually use the name of Jesus. They mention we cast you out in the name of Jesus, who Paul preaches. And the demon says, well, I know who Jesus is, and I've heard of Paul, but who the heck are you? And he attacks them and drives them out into the street, apparently unclothed. So it's a bit embarrassing. But they also still kind of use the name of Jesus, but it's indicated in this text they didn't always do that. So sometimes they would use God just as their reference without mentioning Jesus specifically. We also know about such exorcists from the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived later on in the 1st century. And he talks about Jewish exorcistic practice and so forth. And he has an additional mode of exorcism. In episode 188 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, about why it's not always demons and what are some of the dangers of assuming it is demons, I start that episode with a series of 6 or 7 stories, all news stories, all from the last 2 years before I recorded it, about instances where people were assumed to be demonically possessed and got killed in at-home exorcisms. Like, oh, my 2-year-old daughter is throwing temper tantrums. She must be demonically possessed, so let's hold her head under scalding hot water to drive the demons out of her. Okay, not a good practice. And that's specifically why I do these 6 or 7 stories, all from the previous 2 years, to make the point, if you just assume it's demons without good evidence, like just because a 2-year-old is throwing tantrums, it can lead to serious problems. So this is not an assumption we want to make. And by the way, at-home exorcisms are not the way to go. Nobody drowns in scalding hot water in a Catholic exorcism. That is not one of the procedures that's provided for in the manual. But some exorcists have used physical discomfort to try, in various world religions, to try to dislodge the demon. And it kind of makes sense. If you've got a harmful spirit in someone, you could make it uncomfortable for them to stay. And that actually goes along with my theory of the holiness overload, in that you're making it uncomfortable for them to stay because holiness is uncomfortable for them. But it's not uncomfortable for a person who's not a demon. And so it doesn't injure the person to expose them to holy water and prayers and things like that. So unless you're doing something that's not provided for in the ritual, it's not going to hurt the person, but it will make the demon uncomfortable and hopefully enough to leave. Well, okay, so other religions, though, don't have the constraints that the Catholic Church does about don't hurt the demoniac. In fact, many of these were, I hate to say it, but they were done by folks in the Protestant community who don't have established rituals for this. And they're just kind of making it up on their own because they're desperate and, dealing with this problem. And they're trying what might work. Well, according to Josephus, some Jewish exorcists did use a kind of discomfort-based exorcism, where they would take, he cites a particular Jewish exorcist who, if I recall correctly, he had actually seen this exorcist operate, but he had a kind of plant matter that smelled really bad. And he had it in a ring, and he would expose the demoniac's nose to this evil smelling plant matter to try to drive the demon out. And so there's another model for how physical discomfort, for how exorcism could work. And in this case, he also had it's been a while since I looked up this passage, but he also had a test for the demon to show that it had left the person. If I recall correctly, the test was he's got like a little basin of water or something, and the demon's supposed to knock that over when it leaves. And so he had both a way to get rid of the demon, and he had a test to show that the demon had left. And a lot of this in the Jewish community was linked to the figure of Solomon. who has this reputation as, the wisest king of Israel. And so, well, if he's wise about stuff, he ought to know about how to get rid of a demon. And so Solomonic magic then became a subject that was explored in the last couple of millennia. We don't have any biblical evidence that Solomon really did anything with regard to demons, although maybe he did. I certainly couldn't rule it out. Like I said, every religion has ways of dealing with harmful spirits. And if you got someone with a reputation for wisdom, he might have looked into this area. I just don't have historical proof that he had anything to do with demons, but the Solomonic magical tradition is a notable tradition. In any event, and we also read about Jewish exorcists in other contexts, although it becomes less prominent in Judaism as time goes along. Justin Sledge had a nice way of putting it on his channel that in the divorce between Christianity and Judaism, Christianity got exorcism. It's kind of like getting the kids. And that's one thing that Christianity got was exorcism. Although there was a retrieval of exorcism in the Jewish community after the after dybbukim began to be reported. A dybbuk, for people who may not be familiar, is a typically human soul that possesses another living human for various reasons, but it's still a harmful spirit. It's not a demon in the classical sense. It's not a fallen angel. It's a fallen human spirit. But you want a way to get rid of dybbuks, and so exorcism had something of a revival after dybbuks began being reported in the Kabbalistic community. Oh, so that's question one. Question two: was it common to use a high-ranking demon to successfully manipulate an infernal hierarchical command structure to force lower demons out? No, not at the time of Jesus. And you can tell that by the answer he gives to this objection. He doesn't just say, if I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your sons cast them out? He also, and this is, if memory serves, is in both Matthew and Mark, he also says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. If Satan casts out Satan, then his kingdom is coming to an end. And so the basic idea there is the devil runs too tight a ship for that. He's not going to tolerate demons fighting demons in his kingdom, because it would lead, if he did tolerate it, it would lead to civil war. And in the demonic community, and his kingdom would collapse. And he doesn't want that. So Satan does not drive out Satan. Demons don't drive out other demons. If they did, it would cause ruckuses and rivalries and big internal fights. And the devil's not stupid enough to promote that kind of self-destructive behavior in his kingdom. So it is, even though later in church history, Christian history, you will find necromantic magic where you're saying things like, in the name of Satan, I'm binding you, you lower demon, to do X, Y, and Z. The evidence of the Gospels indicates that's not likely to be effective. Because it would imply pitting demonic force against demonic force. And I mean, the first thought I would have is, who says Satan's going to go along with you? If you're invoking the name of Satan to bully some lower demon, what makes you think Satan's going to listen to you? Why isn't he just going to ignore you and do nothing to that lower demon and say, hey, good job, little buddy. You go on possessing that person. And secondly, based on what Jesus tells us about how these situations work, the devil is not going to engage in demon versus demon conflict, because he's got a coalition he wants to keep together. He's not going to cause fractions in that coalition. And so it was not common in certainly in Christian exorcism, to try to bully lower ranking demons by invoking higher ranking demons. I can't say it didn't happen, but it was not common, and certainly not in the day of Jesus, because otherwise it would deprive his argument of all force. If it was a commonly accepted Jewish practice to say, oh yeah, this exorcist over here, he's using high-ranking demons to eject low-ranking demons, well, it would deprive Jesus' argument of its rhetorical force. And so the fact Jesus used this argument and the fact that the evangelist preserved this argument for us to read about means this was not a common practice, and so it makes sense for Jesus to use this argument. So it wasn't common in either Christian or Jewish exorcism at the time.
Thank you for that context, Jimmy. And I love the richness of that. And to your point that you just made a moment ago about how it was perhaps later on, this might have evolved. This kind of just a quick follow-up, because one of the, I think he died in 1609, but Girolamo Menghi, this is the devil's scourge, the Italian Renaissance. In his exorcisms before the 1614 rite was codified, exactly to your point, there are exorcisms saying, Satan, bind this demon and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I guess exactly to your point.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. It's just later, as far as I know.
Exactly. And so do you think, this is a perfect question, especially someone for your theological opinion on this, is because you had later, as you said, exorcists who were doing this, and then he passed away, other exorcists did. Do you think that the reason why the 1614 rite needed to happen, and maybe one of the many reasons, was you maybe did have other exorcists doing things that were manipulating infernal command structures, and the church said, hold on, we need to have a codified, homogeneous structure here. Would that be somewhat fair, or what's your theological opinion?
Yeah, so the reason the 1614 rite came about was because of perceived problems with various rites of exorcism that were in use. It was not initially imposed across the Latin Church as a matter of you must use this rite. It eventually was mandated, but across the Latin rite. But originally, it was presented as a model exorcism. And so you could still do other local exorcisms, but they needed to reflect the principles in the 1614 rite. And eventually they just said, okay, guys, just use the 1614 rite.
Thank you, Jimmy. And listeners definitely appreciate that. And, Jimmy, you're offering some really rich context that I think will help us inform as we look at history. And I love that distinction you make about at the time of Jesus versus those later evolutions that you shared about. Speaking of, one of the first questions on the podcast, we were discussing, possession and exorcisms and simply strange phenomena. And to that point, Jimmy, we have another listener question for you from Twice and Thrice, which I always love the name.
So that adds up to 6?
Oh, yeah, I guess I suppose that would. So we have a question from 6 / Twice and Thrice. Yes, very good point. Who's saying, hello, Alex.
It's like on the old show, The Prisoner, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
There you go. It's so.
Who are you? I'm Twice and Thrice.
I'm Twice and Thrice. Obviously, what name do you know me by? Yes, that's awesome. So Twice and Thrice is asking to that point, saying, question for Jimmy. From a Catholic perspective, are all genuine possession cases automatically considered demonic, or could there be other non-human intelligences like archonic or reptilian capable of mimicking it? Twice and Thrice says, I ask because I once witnessed something with my very young child in the early witching hour that involved impossible physical contortions, multiple unknown languages, and an hour-long fixed gaze, but certain elements didn't match classic demonic cases I've studied. As of today, years later, he still sleepwalks and sleep talks in an endless variety of voices and languages, though he never leaves his room, and he now began experiencing very violent episodes of sleep paralysis. So Twice and Thrice is asking, Jimmy, would the church still treat this, or a case like this, as purely demonic, or might it consider another category altogether?
Okay, so we really have 2 questions here, so I'll back up and do the first one first, which is, from a Catholic perspective, are all genuine possession cases automatically considered demonic? The answer is this is an area where we don't have a church teaching. So the answer is it's going to depend on who you ask. There are people who would say if someone's possessed, it's definitely a demon. There are other, and some of them are exorcists. There are other exorcists who would say, no, not necessarily. One of the things exorcists do run into is personalities in the course of the exorcism that claim to be a human being. Like they might claim to be Judas or Nero or someone like that. And then there's a question of, do you believe them or not? And the 1614 rite says, pay no attention to what they say. It's like, doesn't matter if they're saying they're human, get them out. But it also doesn't definitively settle the question one way or the other. And so I know there are exorcists who are happy to entertain the possibility that sometimes a wicked human, a damned soul, might possess a living person alongside of demons, let's say, or maybe even not alongside them. Also, I'm aware of a case of something, and these would effectively be dybbuks, just manifested in a Christian context. And I do plan a future mysterious world about dybbuks. But I'm also aware that that involuntary possession may involve more than that. There is, I think it's Alois Weisinger, who was a Cistercian abbot who was also a parapsychologist in the 20th century. It was either him or the British Jesuit Father Herbert Thurston, who was also a parapsychologist in the 20th century. But I think it was Weisinger, who records a case that occurred, I want to say in the 1930s in Italy, where a young girl who was, I think, a teenager, apparently became possessed by the spirit of a man who had been murdered. And what the spirit then did was give enough clues, enough information about how he had died and who had done it, that there could be justice done. And then the mother of this girl said, okay, we've got the information now. I want you to get out of my daughter. And it just left. Okay, so this is not behavior that is characteristic of what demons normally do. They don't normally show up and try to give you data to solve a murder and then leave as soon as you ask them to. So this could suggest that this was not a damned soul or a demon, but maybe a soul in purgatory or something like that, who is doing what it can to try to resolve business left over from life, which is a commonly reported thing that purgatorial souls do, is they try to find ways to resolve leftover business from life so that they can move on in the afterlife. So that fact pattern would fit what a purgatorial soul might do if it had no other way of communicating with the living, but, I can use this girl to communicate. But it still involved involuntary possession, and it's just temporary and benign. There are other people who might say there are possibilities there. Then there's Mary the Arab, or Miriam the Arab, who was a nun that reported being in the, I want to say late 19th, early 20th century, who reported being possessed by a good angel. And so there are reports of not necessarily involuntary possession, but of possession involving good angels. So even though the answer to Twice and Thrice's first question is it's going to depend on who you ask, I don't have a way of restricting it to just demons. And so in principle, I'm open to all of those options. And unless someone can give me an argument for why some of them can't happen, I have to be open to, well, maybe they could. And therefore, I couldn't eliminate the possibility that there are other kinds of spirits that are neither angelic nor human that also might be involved. Now, I don't know what, and I don't know. I know what the archons were in Gnosticism. I'm not sure how twice and thrice is using that term. I would be skeptical of the archons in Gnosticism. And would say either they probably didn't exist, or because they contradict Christian teaching, or they're demons. She also mentions, I assume it's a she, mentions reptilian spirits, and I'm aware of claims about reptilian aliens. And if aliens exist and are living creatures, well, they're going to have souls too. And there might be reptilian aliens, but I don't have any evidence for them. But I can't rule them out in principle. Aquinas would say, based on Aristotle, every living creature has a soul. That's what makes it alive. And so if there are reptilian aliens, and I don't know that there are, but if there are, well, they would have reptilian spirits. And so I don't have any evidence of this, but I can't reject the possibility in principle. And there could be other kinds of spirits that God just hadn't told us about. And if they're positive spirits, they'd get classified as angels, given the way the term gets used these days, even if they're ones we've never heard of before. If they're harmful, they'd get classified as demons, even if we've never heard of them before. Or they could be kind of like us and are, neither 100% on team good or 100% on team bad. So all of those are possibilities. When it comes to twice and thrice's second question of would the church still treat this situation as purely demonic going on with the very young child who may not be quite so young anymore, would the church still treat this situation as purely demonic, or might it consider another category altogether? It definitely would consider other categories. Now, Twice and Thrice has said some stuff about what was going on with the child and what is going on with the child now. And although there are some similarities to the diagnostic criteria that are used in possession cases, there are also gaps in that of things that are not being mentioned that are also used to diagnose demonic possession. And we haven't even talked about natural things it could be. It could be a parasomnia. Twice and Thrice mentions that the child has begun experiencing violent episodes of sleep paralysis. Okay, that's a parasomnia. That's a natural condition. Sleep paralysis is when there is a mismatch when you're waking up and your mind comes back online, but the brain module that paralyzes us when we're asleep so that we don't act out our dreams and endanger ourselves and others, that stays on. And so there's a mismatch. It's like I'm conscious, but I can't move, which is a very frightening experience and can feed night terrors and all kinds of things like that. Okay, well, if there's sleep, so that's a parasomnia right there. Twice and Thrice also mentions sleepwalking. That's a second parasomnia, which is where the paralysis module fails to turn on. So we've got two parasomnias here that are natural conditions. Also, sleep talking is a parasomnia. We have multiple parasomnias here. And so I would say this may not be anything demonic or related to spirits at all. It could be that the child has something going on in the sleep centers of their brain that are producing these different effects. And in exorcism situations, the exorcist is required to investigate natural alternatives first before proceeding to do a major exorcism. And so if I were involved in this case, I'm not an exorcist, but because I'm not a priest, but I am a parapsychological investigator. I've been specially trained in how to investigate parapsychological cases. And if I was investigating this case, one of the things I would do is say, let's bring in a sleep specialist. Let's have the child spend some time in a sleep lab, being monitored, and see to what extent can the phenomena that are occurring, that are being reported, to what extent could they be explained and addressed naturally and medically before proceeding to say there must be a spirit involved here. This is standard procedure among this is standard procedure among competent paranormal investigators. When you look at a situation, you make a list of everything that could explain the phenomena that are being experienced, and then you go down that list, starting with the natural explanations. And because normal explanations are more common than paranormal explanations. So if you can explain what's happening with just normal factors at work, you don't need to propose paranormal factors. Also, competent paranormal investigators generally find that even in cases where something paranormal is happening, usually there are some factors that are just normal, but have been misidentified as paranormal. Because once you think there's a ghost in my house, suddenly every bump in the night, oh, there's that ghost again. You start looking at everything through the lens that you are thinking about paranormally, but really it's like, no, it's just the air conditioning system causing stuff to vibrate at night. And so almost always there is, even in genuine cases of paranormal activity, there is some measure, maybe all of it, that is due to natural causes.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And you know what? I'm checking the Patreon here since I had the initial question. I did talk to Twice and Thrice because I thought maybe medical support. Twice and Thrice says, this was a couple days ago, no medical support. Science is utterly lost in these matters. I've had well over 100. Apparently Twice and Thrice, not the child, has had well over 100 sleep paralysis episodes. And one of your other guests said it best: whether I like it or not, the spirit world keeps showing up for me and for anyone who shares my home, which made me think of potential infestation or maybe another natural explanation, as you said. It's
possible, but if Twice and Thrice and the child both have parasomnias involving sleep paralysis, it could be an environmental factor. It could even be a genetic factor. But if it also happens to other people in the house, I would look for are there non-genetic factors that could be environmental that could result in sleep paralysis, like maybe some kind of mold is growing in the house that's causing parasomnias. And so anyway, I haven't consulted on this case, but so I can't address the case and say, here's what's going on. But the church would look at other options besides just the demonic. And actually, hopefully, something natural could be found, because if it's something natural, it may be possible to address it naturally.
Absolutely. And again, I appreciate that, Jimmy, because you're coming back to, as on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, faith and reason. And as someone engaged in the parapsychological, making a checklist of all the potential natural things, going through those first before you look at other things or considering them simultaneously. That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that context. And I know that Twice and Thrice will also very much appreciate it, as I do.
I hope it's helpful.
Yes, same.
And even if it doesn't lead to a practical solution, it may be reassuring that maybe this isn't a demon. Maybe it's something else. Right. There are few things that are more scary than a demon has affected me and I can't do anything about it. Even if you can't do anything about it, maybe it's not a demon is a relieving thought.
100%. Yes. Here's certainly hoping. Absolutely. Speaking of, Jimmy, another theme that you've touched on here, which is, drawing on the rich tradition of the historical tradition, the medieval tradition, and offering your theological opinions. We have a listener question for you from Gabriel Shearer. And Gabriel is asking and saying, perhaps the church and Western magicians face a similar dilemma in choosing which practices can adapt with the times and which should adhere to tradition. stepping into that river of tradition is part of what makes working with grimoires so rich and beautiful. But are there practices, Gabriel's asking, we can and perhaps should adapt to our own time and place?
Well, speaking from a Catholic perspective, I would say that, yeah, there are practices from the past that need adaptation with time. What those are going to be is going to depend on a variety of different factors. But, this is part of what the church does, and it's part of what the church is. The technical word is its magisterium. Magister is Latin for teacher, so the church's magisterium is its teaching authority that Christ gave it. It's basically, for functional purposes, it's the bishops teaching in union with the Pope. And the Catholic belief is they're given special guidance by God in sorting through both scripture and tradition, which are the two sources of information, and they substantially overlap, but they're the two sources of information that the church draws from for its faith. And so it's the job ultimately of the magisterium to help the faithful understand scripture and tradition and as they apply to the faith. And that requires, and so there is a value to tradition that the Catholic Church acknowledges. At the same time, as the church encounters new circumstances, like people propose new ideas. Well, how does this new idea fit with scripture and tradition? Do they imply this new idea, or is this new idea consistent with them, or have we learned something that would contradict this new idea? If it pertains to the faith, as opposed to, for example, being a matter of science, or purely history or something like that. But if it pertains to the faith, it's the church's magisterium's job to sort out that question. And so there are adaptations that need to be made. That's why, for example, the 1998 rite of exorcism was made. That's why there's a revision to the 1614 rite. Now, today, both are allowed to be used, but there was a perceived need to make some further adaptations from the 1614 rite that were attempted to be made with the 1998 rite. So that's one illustration. Also, now I don't read grimoires generally or for purposes of, practicing what's in them. But, earlier I had the Ancient Christian Magic book, and I read that ritual for a good singing voice. Well, there's perfectly fine stuff in that. And so if Catholics today wanted to revive that ritual, well, if they wanted to use it officially, they're going to need to get a bishop's permission. But even if there are problematic elements in that, like there were some nomina magica in it that were unintelligible, and so I could see a bishop saying, all the theology here is good, but I don't like these nomina magica. So, okay, we'll take those out. Well, that would be part of a discernment process for what's good here and what's not good here, and what can we adapt and what should we leave alone, or could we leave alone? And so I would say that's an example of the sorting the wheat from the chaff, to borrow a phrase from a rather well-known figure in the New Testament. Actually, that's John the Baptist. But I would say, apropos of Gabrielle's question, that similar principles are involved in both domains. And coming from a Catholic point of view, I would say, yeah, we should be unafraid to look at questions and make adaptations, but not make them with changing circumstances, but also not make them rashly. I think it was G.K. Chesterton, the British Catholic author, who had a saying that you should never tear down a fence until you've learned why the fence was built in the first place.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I love that with discernment and applying, again, faith and reason, but also in a Catholic context, definitely making sure to have things, if you want to consult your local ordinary, the bishop, making sure things are approved, but also using that discernment and showing fidelity to the teaching. That's wonderful, Jimmy. Thank you. And speaking of, I think it's a word going back, 1,000, 2,000 years when St. Augustine was writing about it, but the Goetia or Goetic, we have a Goetic question for you. A listener question from Frater Carcosa, who is asking and saying, as there are several of the Goetic legions.
By the way,
yes,
I like the name Frater Carcosa. So that means Frater is brother. Yeah. So this is Brother Carcosa. And ultimately it comes from Ambrose Bierce, but it's made even more famous in The King in Yellow. So yes. I get the literary reference, and I could ask Frater Carcosa to drop the mask and tell us who he really is, but he'd only respond by saying, "I'm not wearing a mask."
See, this is why.
And if you know The King in Yellow, you'll get that reference.
Yes, this is one of 85 reasons why I'm so loving this, Jimmy, because I can nerd out with you on this. The King in Yellow, allegedly, listeners, if you don't know exactly, this was written in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. The King in Yellow allegedly has at the heart of it a play, and all who read this play, almost like a chthonic version of Shakespeare's King Lear or whatever it is, go mad and they lose all access to sanity,
or have something bad happen to them. Yeah,
or have something
cursed
bad.
Play. Yeah,
yes. So and saying I'm not wearing a mask. That I remember reading that the first time, and I was equally very, very chilled. So that is awesome, Jimmy. I absolutely love that. And so Frater Carcosa, wearing a mask or not, to confirm later, is asking and saying, as there are several of the Goetic legions, and I believe he's referencing here, Jimmy, a 1600s grimoire, the Lemegeton Clavicula Salomonis, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, in English in the 1600s, but it has roots going back to the 1300s. And he says, there are several Goetic spirits or legions that are known to grant prelacies, and he lists a few spirits. Is there any, Frater Carcosa is asking, is there any protocol in the Catholic Church to investigate or divine whether or not a person has gained their clerical rank via demonic infiltration? And Jimmy, let me just say, some people might not know what a prelacy is as well. So
it's a position it's a privileged position in the Catholic Church. Prelacies, a prelate is a person who has been granted a particular type of position. Historically, they often carried incomes with them. Like people would tithe to the church or give donations to the church, and prelates would be given some fraction of that. So sometimes it was also called, these were financial considerations were also sometimes called benefices. And so one might say, hey, I'd like to have some extra income, and I'd like to have the social prestige of being a prelate in the church. So maybe I'll conjure up. This will be a little type 3 necromancy. I'm going to conjure up one of these Goetic legions and ask them to engineer things so that I end up getting appointed as a prelate. And I can have the prestige and the power and the money and all that kind of stuff. Well, today prelacies are much more modest in terms of money. I mean, you might get a living allowance or something, but it's not going to be fancy. But people still can have prestige and power, although that's not the purpose of the prelacy. But there is a certain amount of prestige associated with being a prelate, and a vain person could exploit that and crave that, even if, and in so doing, they would be violating Jesus's teaching that the greatest among you is the one who's going to be the servant of all. They would be pursuing this out of vainglory rather than genuine motives of service. So is there a protocol in the church to figure out whether someone has gained their clerical rank through demonic infiltration or influence? Well, the short answer is no. There is no rite for, like, if you look here in the Book of Blessings, or if you look in the Sacramentary, which contains, or if you look in the rites, there is no rite for, oh God, tell me if this guy used demons to get his current rank. So there isn't any rite to do that, R-I-T-E. But there would be ways of investigating it. And there's not an established rite for investigating it. But if I were contacted by a bishop or someone from the Vatican and they said, we have some reason to think that this guy may be doing demonic magic, and we've heard reports that it could have affected his career in some ways, how would you go about investigating this? I would be able to put together a program to work to investigate it. The program would be based on naturalistic principles of looking at and weighing evidence from that is objectively ascertainable. It would not involve directly consulting a spirit. But by interviewing humans and saying, what have you seen? What have you witnessed? Things like that. How did this person's career unfold? I could design a program that would enable one to get at this question. But it strikes me today that most high prelates in the church are probably not there due to practicing demonic magic. Not today. Maybe in the past. I would suspect this is a kind of danger whose day has probably passed. Today, the danger is more that the prelate has been influenced by the zeitgeist and is tempted to disbelieve in demons altogether rather than trying to invoke them for personal gain.
Again, thank you, Jimmy, for the nuance there, even though there's not a specific RITE, but potentially using the available information to build a program, I think is a fascinating thing. Thank you for sharing that. And since you just ended on this with, a time that has passed or sticking in the past, we have a question, a listener question for you from Jameson, and specifically talking about reading works through a Christian lens. And Jameson is asking and saying, quote, "Hey, Alex, excited to write in for the first time. So am I, Jameson. That's awesome. My question for Jimmy Akin is this. During the Renaissance, many priests looked to the works of so-called pagan prophets who seemed to foretell the coming and sacrifice of Jesus.
Like the Sibyls.
Like the Sibyls. There you go. Evaluating their works for other divinely inspired insights. One of these works was the Corpus Hermeticum of Hermes Trismegistus, whose ideas began to be incorporated into the Catholic faith for a short time, including the ascension of the Hermetic Pope, Alexander Eth. And of course, Jimmy, feel free to weigh in on any of this.
Yeah, just quickly, her material from the Corpus Hermeticum was never incorporated into the Catholic faith. It may have been incorporated into Catholic theology among some authors. And I should clarify the distinction. The faith is official church teaching. It's what the church teaches. Theology is a matter of opinion. So if something's a matter in Catholic circles, if something's a matter of theology, that means it's an open, debatable opinion. But if it's something the church teaches, then it's understood authoritatively, it's understood as part of the faith. Material from the Corpus Hermeticum has never been something that the church has taught as this is true authoritatively. We're telling you this is true. There have been some authors who have incorporated ideas from Hermetic material into their theology or their practice. Like maybe they want to do, Hermetic magic or something. But that's a matter of specific individuals, not here's what the church authoritatively teaches.
Excellent. Thank you for the clarification on that. And I think that's a great thing for, I know myself and all the listeners to keep in mind. And to that point, Jameson says that one of the works of Isaac Casaubon in 1614, the year 1614 again, one of his works, I am going to totally fail at this, De Rebus Sacris et Ecclesiasticus Excertationis, the 16, 16, which sought to discredit the Corpus Hermetica as forgeries, was influential enough to make Hermeticism unpopular in this period of rediscovery and drove Hermetic thought underground, leading ultimately to the creation of the Rosicrucian Order and eventually the now legendary Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But Jameson says now that Casaubon's writings have been reevaluated by modern scholars to have significant errors, and the historical credibility of the text of the Corpus Hermeticum has been largely reestablished, do you, Jimmy, believe that the Catholic magician or the Catholic Church at large should take a second look at this important metaphysical source material? And then secondly, how would you recommend reading pagan metaphysical works through a Christian lens? Thank you.
Okay, so we have a few related questions here. The first one is, I'll mention, I've done some check-in on Pope Alexander VI, who Jameson mentions, and I have been unable to establish any firm connection between Alexander VI and Hermeticism. So it appears, at least based on the reading that I've done, the idea of him as a Hermetic Pope may be based on an urban legend, because the material I've run into has said, no, there's no connection here. But also Isaac Casaubon was a Calvinist. He was not a Catholic, and he was trying to attack the Catholic Church in part by criticizing the idea that there were any possibility of, pagan non-Christian prophets pointing towards Jesus and so forth. So he didn't want, he wanted to say all this pagan stuff is evil. We shouldn't learn about it. We shouldn't do anything about it. And this stuff is all fake. And there has been something of a reassessment of Casaubon's work. I'm not an expert on this, although I'd point folks who are interested, and Jameson actually mentions this in the question. Justin Sledge on his Esoterica channel has a good video on this, and I would recommend that. Casaubon basically he had a very short critique. It was only like 17 pages long of the Hermetic literature, which is large and was even larger in antiquity. And he made some points that have stood up. There are, for example, various uses of language in the Hermetic literature, which allegedly is based on Egyptian, but it clearly is based on Greek. And so it has anachronistic material in them. It cannot be as early as was originally claimed. And one of the things that Casaubon's arguments that has stuck is the idea this information, this material is not as old as claimed. Now, Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Great, is a legendary figure, allegedly from Egypt. He's sometimes linked to the Egyptian god Thoth, who was a god of magic, and the Greek god Hermes, hence the name Hermes Trismegistus. And there's a problem in pinning down when did Hermes Trismegistus, if he was a historical figure, when did he really live? Obviously, Thoth, it's kind of hard to document him in history. We can document when people believed in him, but it's harder to document, was there ever a figure that corresponded to the ibis-headed Thoth, even if you do a reductionistic thing to mythology and say, oh, there must have been some human that inspired this myth, which actually was a strategy that was used for dealing with mythology in the ancient world. That you had ancient authors who would say, oh yeah, the gods were originally just people that legends grew up around. But even if that were true for Hermes and Thoth, we don't know when they lived. There are other claims that date Hermes to be in a contemporary of Moses. So Moses lived about 1200 BC. But and Casaubon is right about this, the language in the Hermetic literature does not date from 1200 BC. It actually dates from the Christian era, and a lot of it does. And modern scholarly estimates place the composition of the Hermetic corpus between about 300 BC and 300 AD. And so that's just to give a kind of general scholarly perspective on this. But Casaubon has been judged wrong about other things he claimed. To get to Jameson's questions, though, do I believe that the Catholic magician or the Catholic Church at large should take a second look at this important metaphysical source material? Well, I can't speak to what a Catholic magician should do, or any magician. Because magic itself is a practice that, depending on how you understand it, is going to be problematic. But what should the Catholic Church do? I would say let scholarship proceed to try to sort out this issue. Just like the Catholic Church, I mean, the Catholic Church doesn't have an official position on, let's say, the Sibylline oracles or the Nag Hammadi texts or the Dead Sea Scrolls. It lets scholars who are experts in these various fields, many of whom are Catholic, explore and try to sort these matters out. And the faith doesn't have any need to be threatened by that. So I would say the Catholic Church at large should let scholarship proceed to examine the Corpus Hermeticum as just like any other ancient source, and see what can be learned about it, what's true about it, what's false about it, and eventually it can be enriching to Catholics like other Christians and other modern people, whether they're people of faith or not, to, be enriched by a knowledge of the past and have an accurate understanding of, okay, so when did these ideas enter human history? And are there elements here that are good? And are there elements here that we need to be wary of? And just take an open-minded, but critically discerning perspective on them. So that's what I'd say to the first question. Jameson also says, how would I recommend reading pagan metaphysical works from a Christian lens? Well, it's not going to be the same for everybody. Some people are going to have a temptation towards paganism that as a Christian, I would disagree with and say you should stay away from it if you're one of these people who has a special temptation to paganism. Just like if you had a special temptation to worship demons, you shouldn't be studying exorcistic texts. And so if someone has a temptation to embrace ideas or practices that are mistaken based on an affective, meaning emotional attraction to paganism or demons or whatever it may be, I would say stay away from it. On the other hand, there are other people who don't have that and who can study these materials safely, and who may even have a reason to study them. I've got my books on magic, right? Some of them right here, physical copies of them. And I understanding how ancient Egyptians thought about it, or how Christians have done practices that some have classified as magical. I think I've illustrated in this very podcast how my knowledge of this can be put to good use. The precondition for me studying these things, though, is having a good understanding of the Catholic faith. So I would say anybody who's going to read pagan works, and, St. Paul did that. I mean, he even quotes, both in the book of Acts and in his own letters, St. Paul quotes from pagan sources. And he was definitely a Christian, but he still knew his pagan literature. Well, the people today can too. You just need to be well-grounded in the Christian faith, whether it's the Catholic understanding, if you're a Catholic, or some other understanding, if you're a different type of Christian. You need to know your own faith well before you start trying to encounter other perspectives. And then that knowledge of your own faith will give you the ability to discern, okay, here's this thing this pagan source is saying. To what degree is that compatible with what I believe? Just like St. Paul did. He found things that Greek poets had written that a Christian can believe that, but he found other things that they would say that, a Christian can't believe that. So in studying pagan metaphysical works or other works from a Christian lens, I would say the first thing is know the Christian faith, particularly your own version of the Christian faith, know it well, so that you've got an early warning system that you can rely on when you're encountering other points of view, whether they're pagan or anything else.
Faith and reason, coming back to, I know those core principles for you, Jimmy, with your podcast and with all of your work. And I that's such a rejuvenating perspective. So thank you for sharing that and elaborating on Jameson's question. And to that very point, Jimmy, we have a few listener questions talking about the Catholic Church views on the supernatural and on demons. And to that point, we have a listener question for you from Alex Wolf, who is asking and saying, my question for Jimmy is, the Catholic Church views demons in a very specific way. That is, leading us from sin and God, tempting us, deceptive in their helpfulness, etc. Conversely, those who practice goetic magic and utilize grimoires have reported helpful and fulfilling encounters with spirits/demons, but also absolutely terrifying encounters, of course. So Alex is saying, Jimmy, does the Catholic Church view these positive, quote unquote, interactions as simply deceit, or can demons be capable of these more transactional encounters without damning the summoner or taking advantage of them? Thanks so much.
Okay, so I'm going to quote the song Slime Creatures from Outer Space by Weird Al Yankovic. Okay. He's singing about how the slime creatures from outer space have invaded Earth and they're causing problems for everybody. Let me get the exact lyrics so I can quote the context. Slime creatures from outer space, lyrics.
While you're pulling that up, that is awesome. I love it.
I don't. So he's singing and he says, they'll rip your head off just for fun. They'll paralyze your mind. They're wearing out their welcome. I don't think I like their kind. They'll suck your brain out through a straw. You just can't trust those guys. Okay, that's true not only of slime creatures from outer space, but of demons who are lying liars who lie. They are working for the father of lies. And so you just can't trust those guys. Sometimes they're going to tell you the truth. Sometimes they're going to act nice to you and do things you want them to. But fundamentally, you just can't trust those guys. And they're like the monkey's paw from the famous story, The Monkey's Paw. Anything you ask them, in the end, it's going to go bad. It may go good for a while, but in the end, it's going to go bad. And so I would say, if you're really dealing with a demon, don't deal with a demon. Now, I mentioned there is like Miriam the Arab, who apparently, according to some reports, was possessed by an angel. Or there was like the Christian dybbuk in Italy I mentioned, where it appeared to be a purgatorial soul who just wanted help solving his murder. Okay, that's a different situation. Here we had evidence that maybe we're not dealing with a demon. But if you are dealing with a demon, I would say from a Christian point of view, do not trust them and have as little to do with them as possible. Because fundamentally, they may be nice to you for a while, but that's not how things are going to end with them. They're going to try to take advantage of you at some point. Demons are like groomers. They will groom you for a while to get you into a position where they can take advantage of you, and then they're going to take advantage of you.
It's a powerful, cautious story about the very high risks of dealing in that area. Thank you, Jimmy, for sharing that. We also have something you've written about for years, and I always think of your book, Teaching with Authority. But we have another listener question for you from Andrew Nikolai. And Andrew is asking and saying, Jimmy, I've always heard that the Vatican is sitting on a treasure trove of grimoires, the largest collection in the world, allegedly. Is this true or just occult folklore?
Well, okay. Hang on. Let me get the episode number because I know I have an episode that touches on this. Okay, it's episode 147, which you can go get to by going to mysterious.fm/147. And that principle works for all of the episodes of Mysterious World. If you know the episode number, you just go to mysterious.fm/that episode number. But that episode is what historically, or at least for the last few centuries, was called the Vatican Secret Archives. Today, it's known, they changed the name, and today it's known because secret used to just mean private. So it was the Vatican Private Archives, but then secret is like, ooh, forbidden knowledge, and it acquired a new meaning in many modern languages. So they changed its name to the Vatican Apostolic Archives. Well, okay, it's a library, and it has a lot of historical material in it, some of it going back centuries. But it's not secret in the sense people think. If you are, I've been to the Vatican website and looked up the application form for how do you get access to the Apostolic Archive, and basically they want to know, are you a historian who's pursuing a genuine historical task? You could demonstrate you're a historian by working as a historian at a university or by documenting that you're working on some historical research project. But basically they want to know, are you a historian? And they don't care what your religion is. You could be a Christian historian, you could be a pagan historian, you could be a Jewish historian, you could be an atheist historian. They don't care. What they want to know is, are you a historian, before they let you start handling historical materials. You know, they don't want you getting Cheetos all over, Cheeto crumbs all over the letter from Henry VIII. They want to know that you're responsible and how you're going to handle these materials. But once you do that, once you fill out the application, you say, here's what I'm working on, here's the materials I want, here are my historical credentials. It's like, yeah, come on over. We'll have the librarians pull them up for you. I don't know, do they have a big collection of grimoires, because I've never asked that question. My suspicion, because they do have material going back quite a ways, is they may have some, but I would be skeptical of the idea that they have the largest collection in the world. The reason I say that is because there was, for a number of centuries, an institution known as the Index of Forbidden Books, which were books that contained material that was regarded as inconsistent or dangerous, at least, for Christians to be exposed to. And this did include some grimoires. So I would not be surprised that, oh yeah, for those dangerous things, we wanted to keep a file copy, so I wouldn't be surprised if they had some, but they haven't gone super out of their way to like, oh, let's collect them all. Got to get them all. I would suspect some private individual who has a collector habit and a fascination with them might well have more, or some university somewhere or something. So I would suspect they have some, but I would at least question the idea that they have the largest collection in the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Jimmy. That's great. I remember I would often ask scholars who come on the podcast, in my head, I think, oh, you have a new Latin manuscript. You probably bribed some priest in the Vatican to sneak you through the catacombs at midnight. And they're like, yeah, I actually just spend like a lot of time in a library with specific Latin translation dictionaries, So I think it goes to your point that there's always different ways to try and get access to the manuscript.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, just for historical information, the Index of Prohibited Books does not exist anymore. It was abolished in the 1960s, so that's not a current activity the church is still doing.
Ah, very good. Okay. Thank you. Again, listeners, I hope you're taking notes as well, because this is just incredibly fruitful. Jimmy, we have 5 more listener questions or so, and then a few of my own at the end if we have time. The next listener question, I'm not sure if he's wearing a mask or not as well, but it's also from Frater Carcosa.
Oh, nice to hear from him again.
Yes, and Frater Carcosa is asking and saying, quote, given that mystics have throughout history have had or been able to cause visions of saints. Joan of Arc, Teresa of Avila come to mind. The prevalence of Marian apparitions and the ability of the magician to evoke spirits to visible appearance, given all of that, Frater Carcosa says, could a person intentionally cause a vision or apparition? And if so, how could the Blessed Virgin be called to appear?
Okay, so one can ask any saint you want to appear. I mean, I could say, "Hey, Blessed Virgin Mary, could you appear to me today?" Well, she could if she chooses and God wills, but she hasn't done that. I haven't really been in the habit of asking her to do that, but I could. And so I suspect that unless she has some special message for me, Jimmy Akin, she might not do that. I might just make a request and it wouldn't go anywhere because I'm not all that special. On the other hand, there are mystics who have apparently relationships with God that are different. He wants to use them to accomplish certain things in the world, and if when they ask the Virgin Mary to appear, they get they get frequent flyer miles or something. It's more likely that their request is going to be granted than mine. So I don't think what happens is that mystics are able to compel Mary or the saints or angels or demons to appear. I don't think that is a power humans have. But they may have a relationship with, let's say, Mystic X has a really special relationship with Mary. They have a very strong Marian devotion. They have great faith that, Mary would appear to them. They're open to doing whatever Mary wants in the world. And Mary has something they can do in the world. So if they ask for Mary to appear to them, Mary might do that in a greater way than Mary might for me. I have a Marian devotion, but I know others have a stronger Marian devotion than I do. Nobody has the same devotion to every saint. I think that various mystics and others have been able to invite saints to appear, and in some cases they may have a special relationship where that request is more successful, but I don't think that mystics have been able to compel an appearance. One of the principles that is discussed in the New Testament is we need to subject everything to God's will. And so we shouldn't just expect that any of our prayers are going to be responded to in the way we want. We're not the ones in charge. We don't see the big picture. It may be like God could say, yeah, I could, do what you want, but then that's going to trigger the Third World War. And I care about all those people who too. And so I'm afraid I have to say no to your request. Well, okay, God sees the big picture. I don't. So it's like, okay, you know best. Here's my request. I'd really appreciate it if you could do this for me, but I understand if it's not the best thing. And so, it's all subject to God's will. And so I guess without repeating myself too much further, I guess that's what I'd have to say on that question.
Yeah, no, this is great. And I think this gets to a final question from Frater Carcosa. We do have a few others. And I think this might go to your earlier point, Jimmy.
A few other questions from others. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so earlier when you were chatting about and you were sharing about authority, regarding exorcism and things like that, Frater Carcosa says, quote, Jimmy, is there an inherent power in apostolic succession that would make it advantageous for the magician to gain said succession, or does it only confer institutional legitimacy rather than a variety of spiritual, magical, or occult power? As an extension, in your opinion, Jimmy, why was or is apostolic succession valued by the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica and other Gnostic, neo-Gnostic, and occult churches?
Well, I never like speaking for other people. So in regard to the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica and other neo-Gnostic and occult churches, I'm afraid you'd have to ask them. I could speculate, but I never like it when people speculate about my motives. And so per the golden rule of treat your neighbor the way you want to be treated, I don't want to speculate about their motives. In terms of, is there an inherent power in apostolic succession that would make it advantageous for the magician to gain said succession? Or does it only confer institutional legitimacy rather than any variety of spiritual, magical, or occult power? We've kind of have several factors occurring in conjunction here. The authority that apostolic succession, which is what bishops have, they're all ordained in a succession that goes back to the apostles, by virtue of their consecration as bishops. That's something that has more than an institutional legitimacy. It actually conveys sacramental power. Now, bishops can, by virtue of their consecration, it conveys several things, but one of them that it conveys is the power to confect all of the sacraments. So they can say the Eucharist in a way that, and some of these are then like shared with priests. So they can consecrate the Eucharist so that it really becomes the body and blood of Christ. As a layman, I can't do that. They share this also with regular priests, they can sacramentally absolve someone in confession. I can't do that. They can ordain people as priests and deacons. I, as a layperson, I can't do that. So they do have spiritual power. The question would then be, in terms of the way Frater Carcosa has phrased the question, could you call that magical or occult? Well, per the definition that I've given of magic as something that's an unapproved rite, well, if someone's a fundamentalist Protestant snake handler, they're going to look at those Catholic rites and say they're magic. So from their perspective, it would be magical. From my perspective, it's just a religious rite. Is it occult? Well, again, a lot of Protestant fundamentalist snake handlers are not known for being particularly Catholic, and many of them don't even know the meaning of the word occult, which just means hidden. But since the spiritual effects of the sacraments are invisible, oh yeah, those Catholic rituals, they're all occult. So they might call it that, but, as a Catholic, I would have this is what God has ordained for us. This is the way we're supposed to do things. And so it's all wholesome. So there is an inherent power that is conveyed by apostolic succession. I can't speak to the particular churches that you name and what their motive would be for trying to acquire apostolic succession. But if one has a wholesome motive for wanting to, be ordained, whether as a priest or as some other kind of minister of Christ's church, well, then it's a noble cause to pursue. On the other hand, having bad motives and pursuing the same office can be a problem. We see an example of that in Acts chapter 8, where the Samaritans have been evangelized by Philip the evangelist, not Philip the apostle. And since he's not an apostle, he can baptize them because anybody can baptize anybody in principle in standard Christian thought. You don't have to be a Christian to baptize someone. An atheist can baptize you. Because baptism is the gateway to the Christian life. And so it needs to be as freely available as possible. So on a Catholic understanding, anybody can baptize you. Now, you want it to be a priest, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, so Philip the evangelist, he's an evangelist. He's not one of the 12, but he's an evangelist. So he evangelizes the Samaritans who were kind of half Jewish people who didn't get along with regular Jews and vice versa. And so he evangelizes them. He preaches the gospel of Christ to them. They embrace the faith, and Philip baptizes them. But he can't give them the next sacrament of Christian initiation, which is confirmation. And so they call to Jerusalem. I mean, they didn't have a phone back then, but they send word to Jerusalem and say, hey, we've got all these new Samaritan Christians. They've been baptized, but they haven't been confirmed yet. Could you send someone who's qualified to lay hands on them and confirm them in the Christian faith and give them the next sacrament of Christian initiation? And so Jerusalem says, oh, cool, Samaritan Christians? Awesome. Let's have Peter and John go down. And so Peter and John come down from Jerusalem, and they lay hands on the Samaritans, and they confirm them, and they start to experience mystical phenomena. They start speaking in tongues or other similar, supernatural phenomena. Well, one of the guys that converted was a magician. He was Simon, known as Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician. And he had amazed people for all kinds of time with his magic practices. But he's like, okay, this Christianity thing, I'm on board with that. I want to be a Christian. And he gets baptized. And then he sees Peter and John come down from Jerusalem, and they're laying hands on people, and their mystical phenomena is happening. And he thinks, wow, this is cool. A man could make a buck off that. So he goes to Peter and John and says, if you give me the ability to confirm people like this, I'll pay you. And this does not get the response that he's hoping for. And Peter says, you're thinking you can buy the gift of God for money. It's like, that's not going to work. God is not on board with that. This is a spiritual thing we're doing. It should not be reduced to an economic transaction. And you need to pray that God will forgive you for this proposal. And he initially does. Now, there are some later stories about him from the 2nd and 3rd century that say, unfortunately, he later went off the rails again. But those are later stories. I don't know how much weight to attribute to them. But because the way it ends in Acts, he's on the mend. And I like to think he stayed on the right path. Even though I don't have proof of that. And there are these later stories, but, so if you're pursuing ordination as, I can impress people with this, or some other unworthy motive, well, then it's not going to go so well for you. But if you are pursuing ordination because you want to serve other people and help them spiritually, then that's a noble goal. And if you're the right person for the job, you can pursue that, and that'll be great. You can serve God in that way.
That's excellent. Again, that's wonderful context. And I said we can't let an episode discussing esotericism go by without bringing up Simon Magus. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Jimmy. And also, speaking of, the menagerie of different expertises that you have and areas of interest, when it comes to faith and reason, we have a great question for you from Joe. And she's saying, hi, Alex, my question for Jimmy. My skepticism often means I try to find the logical explanation, quote unquote, for things, which I find annoying. I'm particularly interested in NDEs, near-death experiences. And Joe's asking, Jimmy, are there any common logical explanations that people come up with for NDEs, which Jimmy can provide arguments against, please? Thank you so much.
Okay. The first thing I'd note is just a terminological point, which is Joe is using the term logical as a synonym for naturalistic or materialistic. And I would say that's a natural thing based on how people use language to do. But I would also caution against it, because you can be logical and propose an explanation for something that is not naturalistic or materialistic. Sometimes logic may point to the spiritual or the paranormal. So I wouldn't wouldn't treat logical as a synonym for a purely naturalistic explanation. Moving on from the terminological point, I've done lots of research on survival. This is one of the three major. It would depend on how you count it. It's one of the two major study areas in parapsychology. The other is the function of psychic abilities. But psychic abilities and the survival of bodily death are the two major subject areas that parapsychology covers. And I have a special interest in survival. And it's not just personal. But intellectual. I have an interest in survival and what science can say about bodily death. So I've done actually quite a number of episodes of Mysterious World that deal with various survival-related factors, including near-death experiences and deathbed visions and after-death communications and all kinds of stuff like that. So you can check those out if you're interested. In terms of naturalistic explanations or materialistic explanations for NDEs, there are a variety that have been proposed, and they all have problems. Some of them are proposals like you have data contamination. So after in recent years, people have heard enough about near-death experiences that they could fake them or imagine them. Like even to illustrate the point of just how much it's penetrated pop culture. There's an episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine where Miles O'Brien and Julian Bashir, the station's engineer and doctor, have made mental contact with the person who's dying, and that person is trying to trick them into thinking they're dying too. And the way the dying person is trying to trick them is they're sitting down together in this corridor and they're watching the corridor being eaten away behind them. And as the oblivion barrier is coming towards them, they're saying like, "Oh wow, I guess that's the tunnel that everyone talks about," And they realize actually this is all just a trick. But the fact they would do this in a Star Trek episode, they would allude to the tunnel that many people report seeing at the end of their lives, shows just how much different aspects of near-death experiences have penetrated the popular mind. And that means that enough information is out there that you have to be careful about, could someone be faking this or could they be imagining it based on what they've heard about this experience? It's like, oh, my heart stopped and I want to believe I had experiences. And, the idea of not having experiences is scary. So maybe I just imagined this. Okay, so that's a possible naturalistic explanation. Or maybe I want a book and movie deal. And that's happened too. There are a number of books about near-death experiences that are fraudulent. And like there was one, I want to say it's The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven. It may not be that one, but it's one particular book is based on a child who allegedly had a near-death experience and then talked about it in a book. There are others. Daniel Brinkley was a figure who very plausibly was a fraud, even though he claimed near-death experiences. There was another called Embraced by the Light by a woman named Betty Eady, that there's evidence that was a fraud. So some people, for money, motives like money, they'll fake an experience. And anytime someone bases an entire book about a single experience or one person's experience, that automatically I throw it out, because there's a significant chance they faked it in order to get the book deal. Because normally near-death experiences are brief enough, you could maybe get a chapter out of it, but you're not getting a whole book out of a typical near-death experience. So this is not what normally happens in a near-death experience. It's an atypical experience. Even if it's real, it's an atypical experience that is not commonly reported, and it represents outlier data that should be excluded from consideration unless it's confirmed by multiple other sources. So both because of the risk of fraud and because of the fact this is eccentric outlier data, it should be set aside. And that applies anytime I find an entire book based on one person's NDE. Whether I suspect them of fraud or not, it's just outlier data. So those are possibilities, but the problem is they don't apply to everybody. There are people who do not know what the commonly reported phenomena are, and these have not just been reported recently. The term near-death experience was introduced in the 1975 book by Raymond Moody, Life After Life, and he was the first. That was the first book to popularly draw attention to this, and subsequently, in examining the historical record, we found earlier NDEs that describe the same phenomena, even though they were not popularly known. And so that's a sign that it can't just all be imagination or fake based on the distribution of this knowledge throughout society. It can't all be that. And there are people in other countries today where this is not commonly known, and they report the same kind of thing. In fact, there are some interesting statistical patterns that are both similar to and different from what Americans report. There's a famous book, I want to say it's called At the Threshold of Death or something like that, by a couple of researchers. It looked at near-death experiences in the English-speaking world and in India. And it looked at how they're both similar and different. One of the things is that, so there are psychopomps, people who guide you into the afterlife, and so you're having your NDE, or maybe you're still on your deathbed. And this happens in both deathbed visions and near-death experiences. But you as you're dying, or whether it's an NDE or a DBV, you're dying and someone shows up, or several someone show up and say, "Hi, we're here to guide you into the afterlife." Sometimes it's a relative. Sometimes it's an angel, or that's what we call them here in the West. We call them angels, but that's not a word in Hindi. In India, they personify death as the god Yama. And Yama has servants known as Yamduts. And so what they will say is, yeah, sometimes it's a relative who shows up to help you into the afterlife, or sometimes it's a Yamdut. But it's clearly the same phenomenon. What we use the term angel for, Indians who are not Christian, those Indians who are not Christian and don't have the concept of angel, they say it was a Yamdut who came to bring me into the afterlife. So, based on various educational factors, now this may be changing, but historically they haven't known as much about NDEs as we've known in the West, because the phenomenon was discovered in the West and began to be written about in the West. So those are some explanations that have been proposed. Most of the other explanations, other than fraud and imagination, are connected with the dying brain. And the idea is that as the brain shuts down, it causes some or all of the experiences that are reported in NDEs. For example, a British skeptic named Susan Blackmore proposed that as the brain dies, the visual cortex in the brain shuts down in such a way that it becomes progressively darker, and that was her explanation for the tunnel that people often report seeing. Okay, so first problem. All of the dying brain proposals are entirely speculative. There is no proof that any of them are correct. And there's good reason for that, which is it is unethical to kill people to do scientific studies on them. So they can't be researched in any standard way. Now, maybe in the future we'll have brain reading technology that'll allow us to establish closer correlations. Maybe we can watch what the person is seeing as their visual cortex shuts down and see, is there correlation? But right now we can't do that. So all of the dying brain proposals are entirely speculation. There is no proof of any of them. Also, there are instances where there's disconfirmation. Like there was a proposal that as part of the dying brain hypothesis that it may be because people are being given drugs that are going to generate in the hospital to try to save their lives, that are going to generate these experiences that induce hallucinations. Except what they found is the people who got the drugs tended to be the ones who didn't have memories of NDEs. So there's a negative correlation between the experiences and the drugs. And the proposal from the NDE side is, you're doping people full of drugs that are designed to make them forget. You don't want people remembering their heart being restarted by electrical shocks. They give people Versed and other drugs that are going to interfere with memory formation. So of course, the ones who got those drugs, they're going to remember less. But there is a very powerful counter argument to all of the dying brain theories or proposals, and that is veridical information. Veridical is a term of art that's used sometimes in philosophy, but it's also used in parapsychology. What veridical information is, now you can hear how it sounds like the word verified. And so it's connected with truth, or veritas in Latin. So veridical information is information that turns out to be true, but that's only one condition you need for veridical information. You also need the information to be beyond random chance. It's not something that could be guessed. And it needs, as the third condition for veridical information, it needs to be something you had no natural way of knowing. So if it's information you had no natural way of knowing, it goes beyond what you could guess, and it turns out to be true anyway, then that's veridical information. Well, here's the thing. Lots of near-death experiences involve veridical information. I'll give you an example. This is an example from, I believe, the 1970s. A woman named Maria was a migrant worker from Mexico. She was working in the Pacific Northwest, and she went into cardiac arrest. And they took her to the hospital, and they started working on her to get her heart restarted, and they got her heart restarted. And so she wakes up, and she's talking a mile a minute in Spanish. And at the time, because this is the 70s, there were not a lot of Spanish speakers working in American hospitals in the Pacific Northwest. So they find one worker at the hospital who knows some Spanish. And she goes in to talk to Maria. And Maria says, I just had this amazing experience. While my heart was stopped, I was floating above myself, looking down at what the doctors and nurses were doing to me. And I could see them working and on me and so forth. And then I started moving around in the hospital. And I went to other rooms and other floors. And on an upper floor of the hospital, I went out on the ledge outside the windows. And I found a blue men's tennis shoe that had scuff marks and a lace wrapped around it. And it was just one men's blue tennis shoe with scuff marks and lace wrapped around it. I don't know what just happened to me. I would love to know what happened. Could you at least check and see if there's such a shoe? So the hospital worker checks, and she starts going around and going into, looking at outside the windows. And on an upper floor, on the ledge outside the window, she finds a single men's blue tennis shoe with scuff marks and the lace wrapped around it. Okay, This information, Maria had no natural way of knowing. They brought her into the hospital at night at ground level. It was dark, and this is on an upper floor, and she was unconscious when they brought her in because she was experiencing cardiac arrest. So no natural way of knowing it. And it goes way beyond random chance. You would not guess that such an object would be on a ledge on an upper floor of this hospital. And it turned out to be true anyway. And this is Maria's shoe is only one example of a near-death experience that has vertical information. There are loads of them. In fact, there is a book which I would recommend. Let me get you the author's name. The name of the book is The Self Does Not Die, and it is by Titus Rivas, Rivas, as well as several other authors. And it is the current edition of it has 128 cases of near-death experiences with vertical information that have been verified by medical personnel. So this is not just cases with vertical information, it's cases with vertical information and some form of verification by medical personnel. So it's not just somebody saying, "Oh, I saw this and I had no way of knowing it." And it's over 100. It's basically 130 in this one volume, and some of them are really interesting. There's like one guy who his heart stops. He has an out-of-body experience as part of his NDE, and he sees the doctors. He's floating up above. He sees the doctors working on him, and there's this one Japanese doctor who's there. This guy's an American, and he's having this experience in America. But there's this one Japanese doctor who he sees flapping his arms like a chicken. And when they get his heart restarted, he's asking about that and saying, "What is the doctor doing flapping his arms like a chicken?" And it so turns out that this Japanese doctor, who he'd never met before, had the habit to keep his hands sterile of pointing with his elbows to different things in the surgical theater. And so that's what he had seen. But again, it's something you wouldn't guess, didn't have a natural way of knowing because he was unconscious, and it turned out to be true. So all of these vertical information scenarios indicate that a naturalistic or materialistic dying brain scenario is not going to explain what's happening in these experiences. Now, you could still propose it's psychic functioning, and someone is retrieving this either before they die or after they get revived. But then why are they interpreting it as an experience that they saw in real time while their heart was stopped? So I think the survival explanation is still the best explanation, even if you open the door to psychic functioning. I think the survival explanation is still the superior one. But those are some considerations I would bring to bear on this subject, and I hope that's helpful.
Oh, that is, Jimmy, that's wonderful. Joe, I don't know about you, but I've been taking a ton of notes, vertical information, the different phases. Thank you, Jimmy, because I feel, and I'm sure Joe does too, much more equipped in case there is somebody with radical skepticism, if you will, coming and saying, "Well, what about this? What about that?" And even citing those instances is just such a wonderful thing. And listeners, check the links below in the video and podcast description for the episodes of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where you can get even more information about the work that you've done. That's wonderful, Jimmy. Well, we have two more listener questions, and then just a few of my own, only if we have time. So the first listener, or the second to last listener question, is from Ana Victoria Esquivel, and she is asking and saying, "Why, Jimmy, is God so quiet in a world where other spirits are so loud? Demons, ghosts, poltergeists, etc. But where is God? Why is he not waving to us? He has always been such a silent figure to me, despite having tried to seek him." So any information or advice or anything on that?
Well, as you point out, this is a subcase of the problem of divine hiddenness. And that divine hiddenness is itself a subcase of the problem of evil. So evil comes in two kinds. This is how philosophers and theologians use the term. There is moral evil, which is what we otherwise call sin. And then there's physical evil, which is anything that's bad that's not moral evil. So it includes physical suffering like pain, but it also includes emotional suffering, like, why don't I have rosy feelings? Why doesn't God make himself obvious to me when I want him to? Okay, well, you're experiencing a form of suffering. It's not physical suffering, but it's a form of suffering, and that means it's a form of natural evil. So the Catholic Church has a general answer to the problem of evil. And the answer, this is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the general answer to the problem of evil in all its forms is that God would not permit any evil to exist unless except for the fact he's going to bring about an equal or greater good as a result of it. Now, he's not going to just abandon us to evil. He will eventually make everything right. And even if it's not in this life, he's going to make everything right. And things will be better for us having tolerated the evil, even though we're not denying this was an evil and we did experience it, but things will be better. In some cases, we can figure out what good it is that God is enabling by allowing an evil. And because we can even do this in our own lives. An example I commonly use is, let's suppose you're a little kid and your parents take you to the doctor to get your childhood vaccinations. And, some people are skeptical of childhood vaccinations, and that's a whole other subject. But let's suppose for the moment they work, or at least your parents think they work. Okay, well, if your parents are right that childhood vaccinations or certain childhood vaccinations work, then they bring you into the doctor to get this vaccination because it's going to spare you getting a horrible disease later on. But what's happening to you at the moment? At the moment, you're having evil happen to you. That shot's going to hurt. And furthermore, you're a little kid. Your parents who you love and trust, who are supposed to take care of you, have brought you to this place. It smells strange. It's cold. There are strangers, and they're going to stick a metal object in my arm. What? That's going to hurt. It's terrifying for the child. And yet, parents will commonly do this because they recognize that it's better to spare the child the long-term suffering of some terrible illness than the momentary discomfort of getting the shot. And pick whatever. I know some people are skeptical of some vaccines, and okay, partition those. Don't worry about those. Pick one that does work. And it can be rational for parents to allow their child to experience a small amount of suffering in order to protect the child and thus provide a greater good for the child. Well, if we can do that with our children, God can do that with us. And so that's the general answer to why does God allow any evil? It's because he's going to bring about a greater good. Now, a child who's say 1 or 2 years old, does not have the ability to figure out what the parents are doing, not when they're super young. Similarly, we in this life are not always able to figure out what is God doing by allowing this particular evil. So, but what we can do is recognize the principle that we use with our children and how God can use the same principle with us. So even though we can't, in many cases, say specifically in this life, here's what God is promoting by doing it this way, we can at least trust him and say, I love God, and God is love. He loves me, and I can trust him. And even if I don't know the reason he's allowing this evil, I can trust that he'll still make it worth my and everybody else's while. Also, I would say different people are different. So that's kind of the general answer to the problem of evil, including the evil of why does God seem hidden to me much of the time. but he's part of it also may be what you're open to. Jesus, it says in the Gospels, in certain towns, he didn't do many miracles because people weren't open to them. Well, okay, if you've got a super skeptical point of view that's not open, and I'm not saying that Anna Victoria does, but I can imagine some people, it's like they kind of have a chip on their shoulder with respect to God. It's like, I don't really believe in you, God, but if you're there, I dare you to show yourself to me. It's like, okay, well, this person is acting up. If you have a snot-nosed kid in high school saying to the teacher, I don't believe you, but I dare you to prove this thing to me. It's like, okay, you know who doesn't deserve my time? It's anyone who takes an attitude like that. In fact, I got an email this was a couple of weeks ago, I guess, but I had an email saying, here's this issue I'm interested in. I bet you won't even answer. And so I emailed back and said, well, you're wrong about that latter point, but the kind of person who takes that kind of hostile attitude is exactly the kind of person who I don't think deserves my time to type them an answer. And so it's like, I'm happy to answer people's questions if I can, but if you're going to, I dare you to answer, I bet you won't. Well, okay, you just qualified yourself as not worth my time trying to answer given that hostile attitude. Well, God may take the same approach. If he's got people who are hostile towards him and closed, and like I said, I'm not saying Anna is like this, but I can imagine there being people who God may say, okay, I'll give you what you need in the end, but I'm not going to go out of my way to make a miracle for you. I've given you enough. Also, but if you're more open to God existing and manifesting himself, you may get more results, or you may get results out of the blue as just a gift. There are people who say, I was walking down the street the other day and wham, I had a mystical experience that I totally wasn't expecting. I didn't do anything to provoke it, but suddenly I had 60 seconds where I perceived all of the joy and harmony in the universe in a way that transcends anything I'd ever experienced before. This was not just, I felt happy. This was, I am experiencing everything in nature as profoundly meaningful and connected and loving for like 60 seconds, and then it vanished. And so there are people who have stronger experiences like that. I would love to have that kind of experience. Thus far, it hadn't been God's choice for me to have that, and I'm okay with that. If he chooses someday to give me a mystical experience like that, I would be very grateful. But I also have what I need. And so I even if there have been times in life that were challenging to me, he's always given me what I need, even if it's like the Rolling Stone song. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you'll find you get what you need. And he's always given me what I need, even if it's not always what I want.
Oh, that's excellent, Jimmy. Thank you. And yeah, keeping an open mind. And I know Anna, she's exactly very open-minded. And so I appreciate that context as well, because again, it's simply about seeing things from a different facet, a different perspective. So thank you for that. And this last listener question is also from Anna. And she's saying, quote, I often hear from Catholic sources that spirits cannot be trusted, that they are often demons who don't have our best interests at heart, which we've spoken about, Jimmy, as well. At the same time, Anna says, I reflect on parts of church history, such as the power struggles of the medieval era, the severe punishments of the Inquisition, and even recent scandals involving clergy abuse. Given these difficult realities, how can we reconcile the Catholic Church's historical and modern failings with the idea that it wants to be a beacon of light and guide people to a path that's good for them, when so much of that trust has been fractured?
Well, so I guess we have a couple of issues at work in this question. The first one is, Anna says, I often hear from Catholic sources that spirits cannot be trusted and they are often demons who do not have our best interests at heart. I agree, there are Catholics who say that. Some of them are well-known popular exorcists who ought to know better. Because the New Testament does not expect us to systematically mistrust spirits. In fact, Catholic tradition doesn't expect us to systematically mistrust spirits. If the Virgin Mary appears to you and you've got evidence it's the Virgin Mary, you ought to trust her. Similarly, if you have a purgatorial spirit, or what historically Catholics have identified ghosts as, you want to help the ghost. You don't want to distrust it. You want to say prayers for it, or have mass said, or, help it resolve business from this life, like maybe find its murderer. Well, okay, you don't need to systematically distrust that. There are angels who show up and, give people apparitions and, prophecies about the future and stuff. The New Testament even gives us tests for, is this a good angel or a bad angel? How can we figure that out? And fundamentally, the overall principle is articulated in 1 John 4, if you want to look it up. John says, do not trust every spirit, but instead test the spirits and see whether they're from God or not. And St. Paul picks up on this same principle in 1 Corinthians 12. Both John and Paul articulate different examples of it, but they're articulating a common principle of, is what the Spirit telling you consistent with what God has already revealed? If the Spirit is telling you something that is consistent with what God has previously revealed, then you're enabled to trust the Spirit, at least provisionally. Now, if it later starts contradicting what God has said, well, then you need to stop trusting it. But you're at least provisionally qualified to trust it if it's what it says is consistent with what God has revealed. On the other hand, if it's not consistent with what God has previously revealed, you should distrust it from the get-go. So notice what John says. He doesn't say, don't trust any spirit. He says, don't trust every spirit. So the attitude John is counseling is not run away and stick your fingers in your ears and go, la, 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 every time a spirit shows up. You can talk to them. You need to talk to them to test them and find out which team are they playing for. So, we should take an open but critical and discerning attitude towards spirits. Therefore, we should not systematically distrust them. We should only distrust spirits, or I put it this way, we should distrust spirits when they give signs of distrustworthiness, like they're telling us some message that disagrees with what God has revealed, or they're telling us stuff that, even if it doesn't contradict what God has revealed, they tell you, hey, the stock market's going to go up tomorrow, and it doesn't. So you don't want to bet a lot of money on what an unreliable spirit is telling you, whether they're unreliable about what the stock market's going to do or whether they're unreliable about what God has revealed. So that's, I guess, what I would say to the first question is we don't need to be skeptical of every spirit. We should be open and discerning to the spirits that we interact with. And the New Testament expects us to interact with spirits. Otherwise, there's no point in including this in the text of 1 John. So that's kind of the first factor that's at work in this question. The second is, the second question I think is actually, if I understand it correctly, which I may not, but if I understand it correctly, it's actually a separate question, which is, how do we reconcile the church's desire to be a spiritual force for good in the world and help people with the fact that there have been notable lapses where the church failed to achieve that goal? And I would say a couple of things. The first one is, I think that's everybody. Almost everybody wants to do good in the world, and yet they don't always succeed in that. So I would say, well, the church is an institution that's composed of living humans, and at least in this life, humans often have good intentions. They want to help people, but they don't always deliver. Sometimes some humans do bad stuff, and that's as true of the church as it is every other institution. You look at the government. Well, the government theoretically is a force for good, and wants to help people and wants to order society in a way that's beneficial to everybody, and it doesn't always work out that way. So I would say that in principle, this is true of every institution, and on a micro scale, it's true of every person. We always want to do more to help people, unless we're sociopaths. We want to do more to help people than we end up fulfilling. So I would say I'd look at the church in the same light. So that's the first thing that I'd say. The second thing that I would say is we do have evidence that God is using the church to do good on balance. It is not always, it's not like every priest or every bishop or every theologian or every Catholic apologist is always doing the right thing. But that doesn't mean that God isn't genuinely using the church as one of his instruments. And so, and we can see that in microcosm, even in the first century. St. Paul, he had sharp elbows. He could be irritable. And you read his writings. I mean, like read the last few chapters in 2 Corinthians, after starting off with, "Hey, I'm so happy. It's all so great." Someone arrives and gives Paul some bad news, and he has a meltdown in the last few chapters of 2 Corinthians. He just totally, goes into meltdown mode and is really negative. So, okay, he had some flaws. You know who else did? St. Peter, the first pope. He's like, "Oh, if everyone else betrays you, I'll die with you." And dude, before the cock crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times. And he did. And so the very first pope was a flawed individual. And yet God still used him. He even goes on to write 2 infallible encyclicals that are right there in your New Testament. They're called 1 Peter and 2 Peter. Despite his human flaws, God could still use him as an individual. Something St. Paul acknowledged. Paul said, "God's using me for the Gentiles. He's using Peter for the Jews." So, even if you're flawed, or even if your institution is flawed, like every institution is, including the Catholic Church, God can still use it. And I think there is evidence. Now, this is not an apologetic show, so, we've been going on for some time, so I don't want to go too deep into it, but I think there is evidence that God uses the Christian community and the Catholic Church specifically to do good in the world. It's, I could go through that in more detail, but that's what I'd say is a matter of principle.
Thank you, Jimmy. That's wonderful. And I think, again, it's key information that challenges. I know myself, and I think this whole conversation has been inviting, rather, listeners to think about things in a different way. Well, Jimmy, these are great themes that you've been touching on, so many different threads, and I very, very much appreciate the generosity of your time. But a very important question, too, which is a last question. We will, of course, Jimmy, link to your Patreon page. Listeners.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Listeners, I support Jimmy Akin on Patreon. Check out the links below. It'll be the first link you see because Jimmy has wonderful content you can get early access to. You can get other content. So check out Jimmy's Patreon. It's wonderful to support creators and Catholic theologians like Jimmy. So Jimmy, of course, will make sure to link to that. But in addition to this, just seeing your show, seeing your Patreon, seeing all of the material, all the writings, the videos, you're always working on something. I'd like to know when you sleep, but also, can you give us a hint on some upcoming books, episodes, projects, or any big issues that you're constantly thinking about?
Well, okay, so I guess you asked about books first, so I'll answer that first. My next scheduled book is going to be an apology. That is a term of art. It means a defense. But it's going to be a book arguing for the Christian faith, and specifically for the Catholic understanding of the Christian faith. But it's going to start in a very dramatic way, and it's going to incorporate material I've never seen other apologists use. I'm going to incorporate parapsychology into my argument for the Christian faith. So we're going to start the book with Maria's shoe. and explain, and this would give us evidence for an afterlife, and if there's an afterlife, maybe you want to have a good one. So what else can we figure out about the afterlife? And ultimately, I'll make an argument for the Christian faith and for the Catholic understanding of the Christian faith and show people arguments that support that. So that's the next apologetic book I have planned. I also have, I mentioned I just did a debate with an atheist on the resurrection of Christ. And as part of reviewing material for that, I reviewed a script that I had written, and the script has actually been filmed, but it hadn't been published in a few years, but it's on Evidence for Christ. So I review all kinds of different Jewish documents about the Messiah and what the Messiah does in different conceptions. And then I review what evidence do we have that Jesus existed? What evidence do we have that he rose from the dead? What evidence do we have about him fulfilling messianic prophecy? And I realized this is a 65,000 word book. I could publish this just changing the word lesson to chapter. And so I'm going to contact the people at my publisher and say, hey, you want this extra one? I could even give it to you before the general apology. So those are religiously themed books that I have coming up. I also have a parapsychology book that I have not written, but I have the notes for it. There are different explanations for what are known in parapsychology as cases of the reincarnation type, or court, which are one explanation, which is like the explanation used in Hinduism, is there's something you could call a soul that gets reborn from one person into another. There are also other theories, though. In Buddhism, there is no eternal self. There's no eternal soul. And so they compare reincarnation to one candle lighting another. And so I call these residue theories. It's like there's some kind of residue that passes from one person to another. And so you have the soul theories, you have the residue theories. Then when parapsychologists came along, they said, could psychic functioning explain cases of the reincarnation type? And some people have proposed yes. And there are, if you look in the existing literature, and by the way, if you want to hear more about this theory, I did a 2-part look at modern reincarnation research on Mysterious World. I can tell you the episode numbers. It's not the earlier series, it's the recent one I did. It's episode 275 and 276. But if you look in the existing literature, most of the proposals in this area, the psychic theories, as opposed to the soul theories or the residue theories, the psychic theories tend to involve proposals of psychic function and operated in really complex or powerful ways, which are known as super psi. But I realized you don't need complex psi. All you need is a psychic link between a present person and a previous person. And all the information that is supportive of the idea that one might otherwise get that this person has lived before, it's just flows through that link. So my proposal is the single source psychic link, which involves simple psychic functioning. And it turns out there's an evolutionary reason, or a set of evolutionary reasons, why this might develop. And it explains some facts in court cases better than the soul theories or the residue theories. So I'm planning on writing a book, and I mentioned this in those 2 episodes of Mysterious World, that eventually I need to write a book to publish this. So I'm planning on writing a book where I explore the different possible explanations for court and specifically focus on the single source psychic link theory and why it has advantages that other competing theories don't have in terms of the data. Also, for Mysterious World, I plan on doing a series of episodes that continue to engage with magical subjects and demonic subjects. I am definitely going to be doing an episode, at least one, on on the medieval clerical necromantic underground or underworld. I'm also going to be doing something on the modern equivalent of that, because there is a modern equivalent of the clerical necromantic underworld. It doesn't take exactly the same form, but it uses the same principle. And I'm also going to be doing some studies of specific exorcism cases, and they will, among other things, demonstrate that demons are lying liars who lie, and you should never believe them.
So many things to keep our ear to the ground on. Single source psychic links, evolutionary reasons for that, modern clerical necromancy, and of course, an incredibly powerful advice there about never to trust the demonic, and they are lying liars who lie. But also exploring esotericism with nuance and evaluating with both faith and reason and the wonderful areas, everything in between. Catholic theologian, parapsychologist, author, philosopher, and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy Akin, Jimmy, thank you so much for taking the time, so generous with your time and your expertise, and coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I look forward to next time.
And that's part 2 of Jimmy's 2-part interview on the podcast Glitch Bottle. Jimmy, is there anything you'd like to say before we close?
I'd just like to say thank you to Alexander Eth and his listeners for the invitation to have a discussion on Glitch Bottle and for all their stimulating questions. I know that some from Glitch Bottle, from the audience, have started listening to Mysterious World, so I want to say welcome to them, and I hope that y'all will keep listening. And like we mentioned in this episode, keep your ears peeled for upcoming episodes of Mysterious World, where we're going to be going into more depth about Catholic thought on demons, exorcism, ceremonial magic, and more.
And what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers?
We'll have links to both the Glitch Bottle YouTube channel and also its homepage.
All right. Now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. This feedback is on our recent episode on the Hell House of Martinez. And the first one up is from Daniel Oshel on Facebook, who writes, I love these episodes because of the investigations involved. They inspire a person to think outside of the box for solutions to problems and to seek truth.
And they do. That's part of a paranormal investigator's job, is to think of everything that could reasonably explain the reported phenomena, whether it's normal or paranormal, and then work through the evidence and see where it points.
Then Non Sum Dignus via email writes,
or Dignus.
Right. I'm not sure exactly how to say it, but it says, thanks for another amazing show. My kids, from my 27-year-old to my 8-year-old, each have their favorite type of episodes. For the 8-year-old, currently, it's the Bigfoot episodes.
Cool. Well, I'm always curious to know what types of episodes folks like, and we do have more Bigfoot episodes on the way.
I'm looking forward to that. Then Arnis Janeskis on Spotify writes, I really appreciate highlighting the practical aspects of such non-supernatural cases. At first annoyed at the prospect of another hoax story, later really glad I listened to all of it. Any chance you would highlight this even more in other paranormal stories you'll cover? P.S. Is your email outdated or just really swamped with emails, as it takes a while to get back?
Yeah, so it depends on what email address you're using. I'll answer that question first. If you're using like feedback@mysterious.fm, that's one that we respond to here in the feedback segment. So we don't typically send responses on other matters. I mean, if it's something quick, like if someone just says, hey, have you thought about this idea, for a possible episode, we'll try to respond to that. But unfortunately, these days, email is so intense that whether it's a personal email of mine or whether it's a show-related email, I can't guarantee there will be a response because there's just too much. I would spend all day doing nothing but answering emails and I wouldn't be able to get my regular work done, I'm afraid. But I try to respond when I can. When it comes to highlighting the non-supernatural aspects of future cases, yes, that is part of the plan. We always look at different cases from both the faith and reason perspectives, and sometimes reason points to at least part of the case being non-supernatural. And I try to have a mix of different answer types on the show, where some it's purely natural, some it's a hoax, some it's not a hoax, but it is natural, some it's a mix of natural and paranormal, and then some it seems to be more towards the purely paranormal end. So I try to have, and sometimes it's undeterminable, but I try to have a range of different answers so it's not the same answer every time. It's not going to be like what you hear on Scooby-Doo or the old Scooby-Doo before it got really good, or what you hear these days on skeptical shows like Skeptoid, where it's always a natural explanation no matter what the data says.
All right. Then our next one comes from Shupiluyuma on our Discord, who writes, regarding the Martinez house and the noxious odors that the investigators did not mention or missed, methane is odorless. The government adds a smell to it, which is why you smell it when turning on the stove, and is non-toxic. However, rotting garbage might also give off H2S, hydrogen sulfide, which smells really bad, even at super low concentrations, and is also toxic. Hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs and might also make you feel physically ill or dizzy.
And thanks very much to Shupiuliuma for pointing that out.
And then finally, our RC Mulhairs 2632 on YouTube writes, the bit about waving a disconnected fluorescent tube as a static electricity detector, if you don't make voom, voom, voom sounds while doing so, it's a lost opportunity.
Yeah, I'd agree, although I think it's better if you make them slower. It's like voom, voom, voom.
Yes, you got to have your lightsaber. Right. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback. And now it's time to hear from you. On today's episode, what are your theories about grimoires, the occult, and the other mysterious topics Jimmy discussed today? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Be sure and check it out by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, you can help me out by liking, commenting, sharing the video, and subscribing. And be sure and hit the bell notification when you subscribe, so you always get notified whenever I have a new video, because I have new videos coming out all the time, and I'd love for you to be able to see them.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week is itself a mystery because of various scheduling things. I haven't yet finally settled on what next week is going to be. I have some ideas, but for the moment, it's a mystery.
Very good. Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, in your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should hit the bell to get notifications. And get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/383. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.